Hello and welcome to Circle Time, the Early Years podcast with me, Glenn Denny. My guest on this edition is a senior lecturer in early years at the University of Northampton, co-chair of the Early Childhood Studies Degree Network, and for her PhD studied the impact of play and learning environments on speech and language. Welcome, Dr. Tanya Richardson.
Hello, thank you for having me. Hello.
Absolute pleasure. Now, I was curious about that. It's kind of one of the reasons I decided to try and drag you into into our podcast is because the play and learning environments, you don't often think about that as something that affects speech and language, but you managed to study it for your PhD. So how did that come about?
Well, first of all, the point of the PhD is that it's got to add something to the environment. It's got to be original. So that was, the fact that you haven't heard about it is great because that makes my PhD more valid. But the way it came about is, as you said, I'm a senior lecturer at university now, but in a previous life, I owned and managed my own day nursery and out of school club. And at the time, we had an Ofsted inspection and they gave us a good and refused to give us an outstanding because we had no outside space. Well, a tiny outside space, kind of probably the size of my dining room, smaller than that probably. So this tiny space that we had, but we used the community a lot and we went, to feed the horses and see the frogs in the stream, but they said it wasn't enough. They refused to give me this outstanding. So I was determined to get an outstanding. So I bought a farmer's field and like you do. And yeah. And in that field set up a forest school. So when I say forest school, I mean that in a very loosest sense of the term, because at the time, as I said, it was a farmer's field. So it was just this flat, blank canvas. And we planted trees and we planted hedgerows and we put mounds of earth in and tyres and all sorts of things to make it less flat. But we started, I'd got staff at the time who were forest school trained, so we adopted the forest school approach, and I did it, I must say, at the time to pay lip service to Ofsted because I wanted to get my outstanding, and I thought we do all this stuff anyway, we just, if this is what they want, then this is what we're going to do. So that's happening, and at the same time we were part of the pilot at the time for Every Child a Talker, which for those of you who remember is about 10-15 years ago now, was a kind of a government initiative to try and encourage speech and language. So we were piloting that, so we were real kind of focused in the setting about speech and language anyway. And then we put this field into the mix, and all of a sudden I noticed that the children who weren't talking much in the setting, who were quite timid, who wouldn't say boo to a goose, who we really were concerned about from a speech and language perspective, got into this field and changed, like their demeanour, how much they spoke, what they said, they just changed completely. So that made me start thinking about, well, what is it in this environment that's different, that prompts that speech and language that we weren't giving them before? As I said, we were going out to the community, we were bringing hay bales inside and all sorts of stuff, but obviously it wasn't the same as what that field was providing. So there started my journey, really. I wanted to see what was it about that environment, what was in that play and learning environment that we weren't doing before that prompted that speech and language. So, as I say, and when I started to look in to see if there was any research in that area already, nothing existed. Nobody really looked at that. Obviously, we know that interactions are really important from speech and language perspective, and what parents' backgrounds and how parents engage with them, but there was nothing out there about what in the environment was there to prompt that. So that was the start of the journey.
There's always something, though, particularly with early years, there's always something that makes you question and go, why do they do that? So yeah, it's interesting that the use of this field in order to placate Ofsted. We'll try not to swear too much in the podcast, obviously.
No, I won't swear.
It's interesting. It started that. So, I mean, Did you, in terms of your PhD, did you look at just the outdoor learning environment, or did you look at sort of both sides of it, the indoor and the outdoor? I mean, a lot of
Yes.
places that they like that flow where the indoors and the outdoors are sort of like they run in parallel, and they're both kind of similar setups. But was that
Yes, so
kind
I
of where
compared
you went?
three different environments. So I compared indoor classrooms, your traditional nursery settings, classroom type environment, and then looked at outdoor classrooms or outdoor spaces that were attached to the setting. And what you tend to find in lots of settings, well, particularly near to me, is that outdoor classroom tends to be a bit of a duplication of what's going on inside, but they just kind of take stuff outside and put a roof on it and leave the sides off to get the fresh air through. So I looked at indoor classrooms, outdoor classrooms, and then natural environments, forest school type environments, or kind of the equivalent of. Yeah. So I looked at the three different environments and how children spoke and interacted.
And what sort of, in terms of the different environments, which one do you think actually was the best environment? And, is the reason why?
Yes, that's a big question. So if I tell you how I looked at this first, so what I did was first thing I did was ask people what they thought was a quality environment for speech and language. And I asked practitioners, parents, speech and language therapists, experts in the field, Ofsted inspectors, authors about the topic, and I asked children.
Mm-hmm.
And out of all of those responses, I came up with a list of 27 elements or 27 things that constituted quality within these different environments. And kind of devised some sort of rating scale using those 27 elements. So I've got this rating scale that's come out of that. And then at the same time, I rigged up children with GoPros and captured what they were saying and where they were saying it. And I then analysed that speech using a tool that speech and language therapists used. I kind of monitor the quality of their utterances. So I monitored their speech quality and I monitored the quality of the environment and then compared the two to see if there was a correlation. And if the higher quality environment that was rated by what all these 27 things that people had said equaled a higher quality of speech. And no surprise, there was a correlation. The higher quality environment impacted the higher quality of speech. But the one that came out the highest, when I compared indoor classrooms, outdoor classrooms, and forest schools, the one that came out the highest for most of them was the outdoor classroom. And I was really quite surprised at that. If I'd have had to put my money on anything, I would have said the forest school, where
Yeah.
kind of natural environment would have done that. But actually, it was the outdoor environment that came out tops. And the reason for that, I think, is because these settings that I used, because they'd got a forest school, all their pedagogies were very similar. So they were all kind of quite Reggio inspired, quite natural in their approach. So those outdoor classrooms were different to what was going on inside, which is not, necessarily what we see in quite a lot of settings, as I said. But in that outdoor classroom, therefore, the children have got access to natural resources. They've got access to aspects that they can take risks with. They've got access to quiet spaces and spaces where they can collaborate, and all of those things were there. But what was different between there and the forest school natural environment was that adults were in a fairly close proximity. And I think in the forest school environment, quite often, those adults weren't nearby. Children were kind of, forest school environments are bigger, aren't they? They're kind of, children have much more space to engage and play, but therefore then they're not being then scaffolded or supported by that significant adult. And what was different, I think, is therefore the outdoor environment ticked best of both worlds almost. It got those resources, but it also got adult interaction. So you can't take away, is my kind of main conclusion really, you can't take away the importance of the interaction. The
Hmm.
environment itself is, we need to kind of emphasize all those, the special bits within the environment, but the environment itself isn't enough. We need that support alongside it. So
Absolutely. I think it's crucially important anyway, whether it's speech and language or whether it's other types of learning that the children are doing, that the adult is always nearby to scaffold and to not to lead or direct, but like occasionally provoke an interest or invite an interest, but always be there to kind of help the child to answer questions when they're needed as well. So it is crucial.
Yeah, definitely. And not just the adult, but that, if we go for Vygotsky and the more knowledgeable other, so a group of children
Mm-hmm.
to surround them. Whereas in forest school type environments, there's so much space. Children can just be playing quite independently, and that's good too. But if we're looking at it from a speech and language perspective, we need that scaffolding, as you say.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I agree with that bit as well. It's not just the adult. I mean, particularly in my own setting as well, where our 2-year-olds and our 3 to 5-year-olds are all together. Like we don't have separate groups as such. And it's interesting how the speech of our younger 2-year-olds is actually slightly more improved or better than you might expect from a traditional sort of nursery where everyone's in separate rooms depending on their age. And it's just interesting where that combination of the older children and their speech and the confidence in their talking is then being passed on to the younger ones.
Yes, definitely rubs off.
It certainly does. So, I mean, it was interesting as well. I'm kind of going back a bit to something you said there. And I was like, it was one of those double take moments where you said, like, as part of your research, you actually wired them up with GoPros. I thought that was an inspired bit of research. I mean, how on earth did you come up with that idea? I mean, that is just inspired.
Yeah, well, I've done some research prior to my doctoral study, and in a similar vein, where I recorded their speech, because I was doing a master's at the time. We were on the ECAT program, and for that, I used like little dictaphones, so they had the microphone clipped on them at that point, and the device that recorded in a little backpack on the back as they trundled about. It started in their pockets, but that didn't work. They ended up with it in backpacks. And that was great. That did the job. But obviously I couldn't see where they were and see what they were playing with and see the environment they were in. So I thought, I've got to do something about that. I need to capture their speech.
So that kind of give you an all-round sort of 360 view of what they were doing as well as what they were saying.
Yeah, I mean, it adds a whole complication to the research process, from an ethics point of view, predominantly, because, the point of research is that you want it to be as natural as possible. You want them to forget that those cameras are there, but then there's all sorts of safeguarding implications, obviously. We've got to make sure that if they disclose anything, I say that research is confidential, but obviously they've got to know that I'm going to be listening. And quite interestingly, we would sit around in a circle before every session. I would explain to them again, that these are clipped on, and I'm doing some work for the big school, and I'm going to write a book and things. And I said, I'm not going to tell anybody what you say, but if I think you're in danger, then I will have to. And I said, an example of that is if I hear you say I'm going to go home and drive daddy's car, then I'll have to tell somebody. And the amount, when I listening back to the recordings, the amount of children said, when I get home, I'm going to drive daddy's car.
But it showed they were listening.
Yes, it did. But it also shows that it's not as naturalistic as I'd hoped for.
Absolutely brilliant. So in terms of like once you kind of like come to your conclusions of that, what sort of impact do you think that would have on settings now that kind of that work has been sort of done and is out there in the big wide world? What sort of impact do you think it will have?
Well, I mean, I've come up with this rating tool, and that's the thing now that we're starting to get that out into the big wide world, as you say. Saying that, it's been trialled at a very small scale, although a PhD feels huge, in the grand scheme of things, it isn't. So I'm in the process of trialing it further just to make sure that it does stand up and it is generalizable. And so, and then the aim is that this tool can be used elsewhere. Now I'm trying it in settings already, settings that I work with locally, and they already are making tweaks to their environment and seeing a difference by using this tool. And I know tools are out there already to assess speech and language. The ECHAS tool is what the most widely used, isn't it? The Early Childhood Environment Rating Scale. ECHAS it's a worldwide thing. But with ECHAS, you can't move it around between environments particularly. It works well in the indoors environment, but not outdoors. And what I wanted to do was get this tool that you could move indoors, outdoors, forest school, museums, train stations, homes, wherever. You could pick it up and you could look at any environment from a speech and language perspective. So just kind of widening that research now to see, can it be applied to other environments. I've just done a research project fairly recently and used it in the home. And again, rigged up with GoPros, and parents did that in the home. And parents audited their environments. And it seems to be playing through. It seems to be working in the same way. And in that way, with that impact as far as that was concerned, we highlighted areas that weren't supported in the home. Just, you can't expect them. They're not settings, are they? The home environment. And so there were gaps in what they'd got within their home, according to these 27 elements. And part of that research project and the funding that I got enabled us to put together resource packs for those parents to support that in their home, and for the settings that were involved to send those resource packs home, and like a story sack type setup. So the impact is slowly trickling out there. But this is going to be my lifetime's work, I think. It's always going to be something more that I can find out. And
always. So, I mean, one thing I'm going to kind of come in with as well, like particularly since you mentioned homes and everything as well. So do you think COVID, dreaded C word, I know, but do you think COVID and the pandemic and lockdowns and everything else has had an impact as well on speech and language? Yeah.
And I don't just think it, the research shows that, and anecdotally, every school I'm going into at the moment saying that the huge difficulties with speech and language, and the huge difficulties with social development as well. And we know, obviously, social and language are kind of closely linked. So, yes, definitely huge. What's interesting is, in the 27 elements that, feature on this audit tool, technology doesn't come into it. When we looked at that, nobody talked about technology at all. And I think technology doesn't enhance speech and language particularly. And when we were in COVID times, obviously there was this increased prevalence of technology, which then knocks out other stuff. There's no time then for the other stuff. If we're on iPads or whatever, we're not drawing, or we're not collaborating or talking in other ways, are we? So COVID definitely has had a huge impact.
Definitely. It's like you say, it's that collaboration, like not just with adults. I mean, it was that juggling act for parents, wasn't it? It's like you've got to look after your child, but also you need to work from home, and you need to make sure that so many pressures as well. But it was that main bit of going to nursery or going to school, and that collaborating with your peers or with the older children or the other adults. And there was that whole mixture just lifted out of their lives, wasn't it?
Definitely. And just, going to the park, going and playing with a stranger, or a child that you meet at the park, how the children do, they just gravitate to each other, don't they? With that parks were all shut down, all of that. I didn't have any of it, the play barn type events, none of that stuff where they would interact, really. And as you say, I don't envy parents at all. Well, that must have been so difficult for them. But we've lost almost 18 months, 2 years of interactions. Those children, going back to what I said at the beginning, it's all well and good having a fabulous environment, but if we haven't got the interactions with it, then those poor children.
It's that kind of the missing piece of the puzzle, isn't it? It was like somebody, if you don't have all the pieces for the puzzle, then it's not all going to join together.
Yeah, exactly.
So, I mean, in terms of so I'm kind of thinking again about the home environment, which I know normally I just focus on the early year settings environment, but it's interesting that you've kind of brought up that aspect. sort of about the home environment. That did you find it difficult to kind of not so much get into the home environment, but also to kind of tailor your research and your kind of the tools and get the parents to sort of use them? Or did you have sort of a core base of parents that you could speak to and kind of develop it with them?
I think it was difficult. I originally had one setting who were happy to work with me. The fact that they were getting resources as part of the research package was, very attractive. So one setting agreed to work with me, but they couldn't recruit enough participants. They couldn't recruit enough parents, and it's fair enough. It's a big ask. I'm kind of being transported into their home through the camera and through them auditing it. It could feel, and although I was really careful to word it all, saying I'm not judging, please, but human nature is to think, isn't it? I've got to, I'm on show almost. So it was hard. They didn't recruit many parents at all at that setting, and I had to then go to another setting to recruit from there too. So and then we didn't get as many as we'd hoped for. So it translated well. I just tweaked the wording on it to make it be less judgmental. Well, we're used to being judged in settings, aren't we? As we said, Ofsted there, we judge ourselves, we do observations all the time. It's just part of what we do. But obviously that's different if you're a parent and you're being, rated or your environment's being rated. So it was worded in a nice way that I didn't want them to feel at all threatened in any of it. But
there is that bit for parents as well, that sometimes they just feel like, there's a lot of pressure on parents as well to kind of do this and do that. And I kind of get that they're sort of, they're thinking of it. It's like, is this just going to be another person to judge me? Whereas it's like, for you, isn't it? It's like trying to change that mindset, and it can be difficult.
Yeah. And who knows if how they rated their environments are reliable, because, as you say, if they're thinking, oh, this person's judging me, they're probably going to score themselves a bit higher than they, they would if they were just, talking to their husband or spouse about it. But we have to take, in any research, we have to just, accept those limitations really and do the best with what we've got. But children's speech in the home environment actually was of much higher quality than it was in the setting. And that again comes down to those interactions, doesn't it? The environment is calmer, it's quieter. Somebody is there on a 1-to-1 or a 1-to-2 basis. You're getting more attention.
It's more familiar as well to the child, which kind of relaxes them a bit more.
Yes, yeah, but quite often the parents say, don't they? Oh, they're so different when they're at nursery to when they're at home.
Yes.
And how they talk is different as well, interestingly. So as I say, this research could just keep going. It's the gift that keeps on giving, really.
So for you, it's definitely, as you said before, it's almost become like it is now your life's work, isn't it? Do you still have that same, I'm going to say yes, but it'd be good to hear from you. Do you still have that same passion as you did when you first embarked on doing all this,
definitely.
back in the ECAT days?
Yeah, more so, if anything, because and this is going to sound really twee, but I think any of us that work in early years, we want to make a difference, don't we? We want to make a difference in children's lives, in those families' lives. And this is my way that I feel that I can make a difference. And as I say, that sounds like real pious and kind of, look at her on her soapbox. But I do feel that if it is something I can impact, that word you said before, I can impact on children and families' lives somehow. So definitely.
It's one of those things as well. It's like, yes, there's that huge push for numeracy and all these other kind of skills. But actually, if you don't have the significant speech or language to make to express yourself, to talk about things, you're going absolutely nowhere. And that needs to be the absolutely core thing, isn't it?
Yeah, it's the reason it's one of the prime areas, isn't it,
Mm.
in the in the curriculum, because I work with some schools and they say their literacy or their phonics is not going particularly well, and then I say, well, let's step back and look at what the speech and language is, because if a child can't speak or has basic understanding, then we're never going to read, are they? They're never going to be able to apply that um, knowledge to phonics. So yeah, we've got to go right back to basics, and unfortunately, children are in the situation where they haven't got those basics in quite a lot of the cases. But what I want from this tool eventually is it to be a kind of a prevention rather than a cure, I think, because
Mhm.
we've got all these children, 26% of children at the moment who've got speech and language difficulties at the age of 4. But if we could get the environment right from the start, then because these interventions, I know there's fabulous work going on, but quite often interventions take children away from the environment. They go on a one-to-one basis, but actually what they need is the social stuff. They need the interactions. We're taking them into somewhere where it actually worsens the situation. And if we can enhance the environment in the first place to stop those children requiring interventions, then I suppose that's my ultimate goal, really.
No, I mean it's a sensible goal because again I mean I've worked in several different kinds of environments myself. I've worked in environments where there's visual noise as well as physical noise with huge, bright, colorful displays, and it's all very distracting and overloading for children.
Yeah.
And then I've worked in settings where we've had 1 or 2 display boards and it's been calm, neutral colors, and actually the noise level has come down. The children have been able to speak, and it is funny to think that that actually is having an impact on children's speech and language.
Yeah. I mean, we know ourselves, don't we? If you think about when we drive somewhere where we don't know where we're going and we get into the city centre and we turn the radio off.
Yeah. I was just going to say that.
Yeah, because we need to think, and that's what we do with children, isn't it? Actually, this noise level is on there. How on earth can they think? How can they process? How can they reflect? How can they communicate when they're in this busy, loud radio in the car environment? Yeah.
No, it is true. I'm going to start laughing about that radio thing again, but yeah, it is absolutely true. But yeah, it's that bit where we do need to calm the noise, like the visual noise, down, because that's equally important, isn't it?
Yeah. And I think sometimes in settings we're all about, aren't we? It's like, right, what's the next learning intention? What are we doing next? What's our next activity? Actually, sometimes they just need time to be, time to just sit and collect their thoughts. So that's one thing that came out of the ECAP program, actually, that at the time I can remember that one of the suggested activities was that you set up a table with nothing on it. And I thought, what a silly idea that is. But I thought, oh, well, we'll go with it. We'll try it. We'll see what happens. And it was amazing that the children congregated around it. They just talked to each other. Actually, sometimes we just need nothing. We need that, but the environment to facilitate nothing.
Yeah. I mean, it's strange that you say that. I know in a previous setting that I worked in the home corner, obviously I'd set the table up for tea, but it was interesting just to watch them just gravitate towards that and sit themselves down and just talk to each other. And it's like, the more you kind of unpick it, the more you think, well, actually, I never thought about that as, I mean, I just set up a nice little table for them to sit and have tea at, but actually it was promoting their speech and language. We all think about, the hub for speech and language being an area where we sit and tell stories, but actually that's completely different.
Yeah. I mean, that's part of it, isn't it? But a very small part, a 27th, if you like, of the, of those 27 elements. Books came into it, but just one small part. They've got to have all those elements working together, really.
Absolutely. Well, it would come in, unfortunately, to the end of this edition of the podcast, but I just want to say a massive thank you for this research and for bringing it out there, and then for the toolkit, because I can tell just by speaking to you that this is going to be so helpful, not just to the children it's going to benefit, but also to the practitioners who will feel the confidence to actually make those changes that will then benefit their children as well. So thank you so much. Dr. Tanya Richardson, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.